Seems like there'd be two ways to introduce John Cobb. One would be a very long introduction to explain all the things that he's done and why he's so important. But I think the other possibility is just to say this is John Cobb, and we're privileged to have him speak to us. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I had made, like many people, I think, I had written out a paper, and it was much, when I found out that David really wanted us to only talk 30 minutes, I said, well, I got up at 4 o'clock this morning to try to cut it out. And now much of what I was going to say has already been said, so that helps me a lot. I do want to say first that I'm delighted to have this event in honor of David, and even though I was aware of the range of his work and so forth, it has come home to me with even greater strength. But even before this, I think on the occasion of his retirement, I made the statement that if he had been my only student, I would consider my years at Claremont well spent. And I think I can say the same thing about Catherine Keller, who is also a part of this event. Okay. The relation of theology and science, or let me just say Christian belief, because I'm more interested in what people believe than in formal doctrinal formulations about it, is very much bound up with the history of science. And what I'm speaking partly existentially, that it was my own experience of the encounter with modernity in many forms. Maybe I should back up and say later than the time I had that experience. And I went to the University of Chicago, and I thought before I went to seminary, which I had thought I would do, I needed to find out whether faith was authentic. And so I enrolled first in the humanities division, and then within the humanities division at Chicago, there was a committee for the analysis of ideas and the study of method. That was a McKeon committee, if any of you are familiar with his name. I say the best way to introduce him is to say he's the one who drove Pirsig crazy. Pirsig is the one who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And I didn't. The difference between us was that Pirsig was active in class with McKeon and tried to answer his questions. And McKeon's style of teaching was to reject all answers to his questions. And I think Pirsig just couldn't take that eventually. I just looked as inconspicuous as possible and huddled in a back corner and listened, and therefore perhaps saved myself from a total nervous breakdown. But that was just, of course, one of the kinds of things. I was simply exposing myself for the first time in my life, really, to the acids of modernity. And the acids of modernity were more powerful than my youthful faith. So the only thing that enabled me to continue in exploration was that I took a few classes with Charles Hartshorne, and he seemed to be familiar with the acids of modernity, but they did not lead him to the rejection of all the things that I didn't much want to reject, but thought I might have to reject, or felt that they were just slipping away from me. It's hard to say to what extent you consciously reject something and to what extent you just discover it's not there anymore. It's not a conscious act. So in any case, that was a very painful experience, but a very important one. And at that time, I decided, well, I have also met a couple of professors from the divinity school here. So I had some encounter with James Luther Adams, and a little bit, I believe, with Amos Wilder, the brother of Thornton Wilder, who taught there and so forth. They seemed to have experience, to know about all the things that were bothering me, which were not particular arguments. It was just a whole way of looking at reality in which God and most of what I understood in terms of Christian values and so forth just didn't really fit. They didn't have a place there. It was that kind of experience. So they knew that, and they'd been through that, and they still had some very significant convictions. Might be very different from the ones I'd had before, but so I decided to go into divinity school, and at that time, the divinity school was a very lively, genuinely intellectual hothouse. I mean, it became the most natural thing in relationship to fellow students to argue about beliefs. And that is not characteristic of most theological schools I have discovered over the years. That's just not the climate. But it was the climate at Chicago, and I'm very grateful for having been there in those particular years, which were intensely theological, very different from religious studies. But some people, when they hear theological, they think that means somehow dogmatic or confessional. And this was a totally no-holds-barred conversation in which you're testing everything. And I'm very grateful for that, because I think I understand some of the intellectual problems in a different way. What would have happened if I hadn't been through that? And increasingly, I learned about Whitehead from different sources. From Hartshorne, I got a very rationalistic version. From the Wymanites, who were quite influential in the faculty, though Wyman had himself left a very empiricist version of Whitehead. From Williams, a more central version, and also a much more churchy version. I mean, he really knew the history of theology and thought about Whitehead in those terms. So I got a variety of versions, but Whitehead became increasingly important to me. And I thought that Whitehead, having been a mathematical physicist himself, could assure me that following in his steps would not be inconsistent with the contemporary state of science. But of course, I wasn't sure. Some decades had gone by, and science changes. So testing what I believed in relationship to science was very important. And at that time, I was probably more where Philip was directing us, that I assumed the people who knew the most about science were the scientists. And that if the scientists in a particular field had some kind of a consensus, that I needed to test my beliefs in relationship to that. I think this is a very common way in which we grow up and think about how to relate to fields that we are not going to study extensively for ourselves, and I knew I wasn't going to become a physicist and a biologist and a chemist and all those things. So that was the way I was operating. But at certain points, I began to see there were tensions between between the consensus of scientists and what I was learning from Whitehead. So I began to see that Whitehead was really not simply a good scientist, but had a particular angle of view upon sciences, which led to possible serious disagreements with the consensus of scientists. And I was somewhat uncomfortable with that. Now, all of this is background for saying I learned something from David. He got it from historians. I never got around to reading these historians, so I didn't get it from them. That made a huge difference. It's been mentioned earlier today. That is a little knowledge of the history of how what we call the scientific worldview came into being. And when I saw that the reasons for having selected the set of beliefs that have become so closely entwined with the modern scientific enterprise included theological reasons, then it occurred to me, well, maybe as a theologian, I could evaluate these theological reasons, and if I didn't share them, then the fact that I didn't know the science well might still make me feel freer to think that maybe some of these consensus ideas were not actually entailed in the science itself. So I owe great debt to David at that point. I mean, that wasn't the beginning of my interest in science and theology, but it was a great release when I decided that the scientism, the set of beliefs that almost all scientists, not all, but the majority of scientists have come to share, was developed partly for the sake of affirming a supernatural God and a supernatural soul. And I was ready to give those, not to give them up. I was very happy to think in a different way about those matters. And then it also turned out that they were selected partly in defense of monarchy over against democracy. And if they were partly selected so as to make people feel more comfortable about tearing up the earth, because there were people who really had the feeling of belonging to the earth, and the earth is our mother, are sometimes reluctant to exploit the earth in the way in which the modern world. Since I didn't like any of those aspects of the reasons that this particular set of beliefs, I guess there's the SAM beliefs that David has talked about, I've really felt comfortable since then in examining what scientists have to say and trying to sort out what parts of what they say are really required by the evidence they have, and what parts of what they say, and I think the same thing is true in the methodologies of the social sciences and all the rest, what parts of it are governed by a metaphysics that is not, it leaves an awful lot of things out, and that was selected for reasons of which I disapprove. Okay. So I owe to David my sense of freedom to try to make those distinctions when I encounter the work that's being done. And that puts me in a very different place from where Philip was presenting. And I would have been much closer to Philip if David hadn't given me that kind of freedom. So I'm very grateful for that. I think that going beyond that, I mean, obviously he got that information from other sources. He's not the originator, but he was my source. But David, having understood this, has gone farther than anybody else in the field of sorting out the beliefs that underlie contemporary consensus theories in various fields. And I approach this matter in a much more impressionistic way. David, I think any of you who've read David know it's not impressionistic. It's point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And I'm assigned the topic of evolution, and it's an excellent one to illustrate his style and what the actual implications are with respect to how, from my point of view, Christian theologians ought to engage the sciences. Very rarely done. Almost only process theologians who engage in this kind of approach. And obviously it's because we think Whitehead knew what he was doing when he developed his thought out of his mathematical physics and out of all the other sources on which he drew. Now, precisely because David's thought is so complex is wrong, so detailed in its analysis and in its distinctions, I'm not going to try to describe this without reading. I think what I've written is accurate, so I'd much rather you would have that. So Griffin, I'm jumping into the middle, and some sentences may presuppose a past that won't have existed for you. Griffin regards this liberal yielding of authority to scientific experts as a mistake on the part of the church. That was the context here. In this respect, he sides with religious conservatives. Unfortunately, the conservative critique is often expressed either in the wholesale rejection of science or in the development of pseudoscience out of traditional religious beliefs. Griffin, in contrast, engages in careful analysis of the distinction between the real needs of science and the evidence that must be affirmed on the one side, and on the other, the influence of problematic assumptions on the formation of theories, including those on which expert opinion among scientists has achieved consensus. I'm one of those who believes that this is an extremely important task and one that is essential in the long run for the health of Christian faith. Recently, Griffin contributed 2 important chapters to a book I edited. In the first of these, this is on the subject of evolution, so we are on my topic at last. Griffin identifies 15 positions taken in the current consensus among evolutionary biologists that we label neo-Darwinism. The first 8 are shared by Darwin himself. Griffin begins with 2 basic scientific doctrines, microevolution and macroevolution, that he agrees are well established. Darwinians have shown that species are not fixed and that they have descended from earlier ones over a long period of time. Griffin then proceeds to identify 5 metaphysical doctrines shared by Darwin and neo-Darwinians. The first 2 he considers essential to science. These are naturalism in the sense of exclusion of supernatural intervention and ontological uniformitarianism. The latter doctrine is that nature has the same characteristics everywhere. Griffin then identifies 3 additional metaphysical assumptions that biologists share with the wider community of science, but which are not essential to science as such. The first 2 are the ideas built into the mechanistic model. He calls them positivism, materialism, and predictive determinism. A great deal of the problem that Christians have with science arise from these. And of course, Griffin shows how they influence scientific work and the conclusions that scientists draw from it. The third metaphysical assumption that Griffin identifies is less often discussed by Christian critics. It is nominalism. This arose in the late Middle Ages and was called the modern way. Griffin identifies it as central to modern science and indeed to modernity generally. It had particular importance for Darwinians because they were overthrowing the idea of that there are fixed species or types. The restoration of something close to a Platonic realism is a distinctive feature of Griffin's thought, to which I will return. Griffin calls the 8th point in his list a derivative scientific doctrine. This is gradualism. Both Darwin and the neo-Darwinians affirm that the emergence of new species occurs gradually through numerous small changes. Griffin regards this as a scientific theory that is not based in any direct sense on the evidence. Instead, it follows from a combination of the scientific points noted above about the descent of contemporary species from earlier species and the metaphysical beliefs he has identified. It cannot claim to be derived directly from the empirical evidence because even today, the vast array of fossils that have been studied fall overwhelmingly into well-differentiated species. If the development of one species from another were gradual, one would expect to find transitional forms. But these are almost non-existent. But abrupt jumps from one species to another do not fit the metaphysical assumptions of modern science. Griffin then turns to these 3 specifically neo-Darwinian scientific doctrines. Darwin himself did not claim to know how the variations occurred among which natural selection took place. He was open to Lamarckian ideas without committing himself to them. Not claiming to know this, he also left open the possibility that the emergence of variations had led to the rise of new species, that is, macroevolution, might be different from the variations known to occur within a species. The neo-Darwinians closed the doors left open by Darwin. The first of three specifically neo-Darwinian scientific doctrines he identifies is that macroevolution does not introduce any mechanisms of change different from those operative in microevolution. Note that calling a doctrine scientific does not mean that it is based on evidence, only that empirical evidence for and against it are in principle possible. In fact, there is little evidence supporting this doctrine. The second of the doctrines in this list is the one that is most evident and may even explain the first. The variations from which natural selection operates are all random. The contrast here is in part with sexual selection or Lamarckian views of inheritance, of characteristics acquired from the behavior of ancestors. Neo-Darwinists found in Mendelian genetics a basis for understanding that changes in genes led to diverse phenotypes and behavior, and these changes were random in a way in which animal behavior is not. At the physical level, there are causal explanations, but they are not oriented to their biological outcome. Having found this as a way of explaining how evolution occurred, the dominant evolutionary community declared it the only way. The third uniquely neo-Darwinian scientific doctrine is that evolution is wholly undirected. David concludes this analysis with 4 items on religion and morality. The implications of the modern scientific worldview have always entailed the exclusion of God from the nature studied by science. But for 2 centuries, there was a general openness to understanding God as creator and lawgiver and as directly involved with human beings in the field of morality. But evolution included human beings in nature and thus excluded God from any relation to them as well. Many Darwinists declare themselves atheists. Some atheists go to great lengths to show that this position does not undercut the meaningfulness of life and the importance of morality. They sometimes appeal to nature as in itself providing us with the meaning that we need. However, leading spokespersons for neo-Darwinism now reject any sense of meaning in nature. If we seek meaning, we must create our own. David lists the meaninglessness of the universe as the next point after atheism. Closely related to this is what he calls amoralism. There are no moral norms. Darwin himself saw an upward tendency in the course of evolution and attributed this to the way God created it. Neo-Darwinists deny any such trend. The very idea of progress is for them meaningless. The only evaluation of an organism they find useful is its adaptation to its environment. A very simple organism may be just as well adapted as a complex one. There is no basis for declaring the complex better. Once the mechanistic view of nature is fully combined with the inclusion of human beings in nature, the religious and moral conclusions drawn by the neo-Darwinists are largely entailed. Does this mean that science as such implies the meaninglessness of life? Griffin's careful analysis shows clearly that it does not. What has become the scientific worldview is not based on scientific discoveries or empirical evidence. It is instead the dogmatic affirmation of one philosophical system whose connections with the evidence are highly problematic. But this in no way implies that we can dismiss science and go on our way. Scientists have learned much that is reliably accurate about the world in which we live and about its human inhabitants. David's extraordinary contribution is to guide us carefully and responsibly into sorting out what, on the one hand, we should appropriate from this work of scientists, and what, on the other hand, we are free to reject. Now, I have a concluding section which is critical. It's a critical argument with David. It's on the subject of Platonic realism. One of Griffin's great strengths is that he ignores questions of current acceptability of ideas. He seeks truth. He has given major attention to parapsychology when this topic has been almost taboo in scholarly and intellectual circles. He has given major attention to the question of what really happened on September 11th, 2001, when the government, the media, and the universities have joined forces to silence that question. He is my authority in both of these areas. So when Griffin tackles the question of Platonic realism, excuse me, I must pay attention. During my lifetime and long before, despite great respect for Plato, his realism with respect to ideas has been viewed as quaint rather than as something that can be taken straightforwardly. I have absorbed that bias and not seriously questioned it. I am even shocked by what Griffin writes on this topic. There is no question but that eternal objects, collectively constituting the primordial nature of God, are an important part of Whitehead's philosophy. This places Whitehead broadly in the Platonic tradition, and more specifically in the Neoplatonic one. I have often defended Whitehead's Platonism against those who wish to deny to ideas or potentials any reality whatsoever. Nevertheless, Griffin's use of Whitehead at this point is somewhat disturbing to other Whiteheadians. My defense of Whitehead in part is in the claim that his eternal objects are in fact very different from Plato's ideas. Plato took for granted that there are numerous species of things and that language identifies these species. Although there are variations among members of a species, the characteristics common to all can be identified and better examples can be distinguished from inferior ones. Similarly, there are definite virtues, and we can discuss what constitutes them fully and perfectly. These ideal forms are much like mathematical objects. We can draw circles and can judge that some of our figures are better circles than others, even if no one is perfect. In mathematics, we can discuss the character of the circle as such. It has been my understanding that modern logic has abandoned this pattern. For example, in relation to the virtues, there are as many distinct eternal objects as there are ideas or possible ideas about them in human minds. The word justice does not refer uniquely to any one of these eternal objects. It may have as many meanings as there are iterations, since absolute identity of meaning in changing context is rare. Of course, many of these meanings are similar, so for practical purposes, people often understand one another well enough, but there is no essence to which the word corresponds. Similarly, in the world of man-made objects, there are no boundaries in the nature of things, separating, for example, tables and desks. There are some objects that almost all speakers of the English language would agree to call tables. and others that almost all would agree to call desks. But there are others on which there would be no such ready agreement. The disagreement is not about whether the object in question is really a table or a desk, because such a question has no answer. This is just a matter of the use of language. There are no essences corresponding to particular terms. In any case, a single object may be classified as a member of more than one class of objects. A wooden table may be classified among wooden objects just as well as among tables. One cannot organize things uniquely in terms of species and genus with the understanding that this corresponds to an eternal and immutable order. With living things also, I've understood that whatever value the old system of ordering them in species and genera still has, it does not correspond to an eternal system of essences. I have supposed that there would always be the possibility, if not always the actuality, of organisms that were no longer clearly members of one recognizable species, but not yet members of one another. Drawing a line and saying that at some moment the first human appeared would be arbitrary rather than illuminating. All depend on how we chose to define human. All of this is to say that I have thought that while Whitehead's eternal objects are certainly in the Platonic tradition, they are radically democratic in the sense that they are not ordered in terms of better and worse. Every pure potential is just a pure potential. It is only with impure potentials, propositions, that potentiality takes on value. Griffin has found statements in Whitehead that sound more Platonic than this. But more important, he sees the absence of transitional organisms in the fossil record as indicating a status for species that the dominant community of evolutionary theorists prefers to ignore. Once again, as often in the past, I see him forcing attention on matters that our dominant theories obscure. In this case, it is the explanation of the saltation or jumps that the fossil evidence suggests. I remain hesitant to explain this absence of transitional types by any eternal ordering of eternal objects. It seems to me there are better approaches. For example, if a new species comes into being by symbiosis, as Lynn Margulis showed has happened, there might be a quite abrupt jump. And perhaps the disappearance of the food on which a species has depended in a particular locale might lead to the death of all except a few members that have a previously unused ability to live on some other food. But Griffin is well ahead of me in reflection on this problem. I follow Griffin in the judgment that neo-Darwinism is a massive failure. The task of reconstructing evolutionary theory lies before us. I must pay more attention to the talk of attractors, which seems to be a word used more and more in biological and evolutionary circles. If that requires developing Whitehead's theory of eternal objects in a more Platonic direction, Griffin will again prove to have been our leader.
Back when Catherine Keller was a graduate student, we planned a conference and she on Jung and Whitehead, and she told us that James Hillman we had to bring. He was the most creative of the Jungians. And so we had decided to, and then I started reading Hillman, and I saw, oh my gosh, he rejects metaphysics. I thought, how in the world are we going to have a meaningful conversation with this fellow? Not only that, I heard he could be horrible to people, just tear them to pieces. And but nevertheless, we had made the arrangements. So I wrote a paper trying to show that might be possible to have a meaningful conversation, and we did. We had arguably up to that day, clearly up to that day, the best conference we ever had. And one of the things that occurred was when Stanley Hopper started criticizing J.H., as we called him. And do you remember what the issue was? Was it on myth, or was one of his technical terms that he had written a lot about? And Hopper started offering criticisms of this. And from what we were so worried that this was just going to explode. It was going to be embarrassing. It wasn't going to be a typical Center for Process Studies meeting where everybody gets along and so on. Well, there was silence. Oh, gosh. And finally, Hillman says, I think I may have to go home and rethink everything I've said about that topic. Well, John, I may have to rethink what I've said about this aspect of evolution. Although at the end you have granted that, well, maybe there might be something too. Well, we may both have to rethink and see if we come to something. But you mentioned or alluded to Lynn Margulis, and certainly I wish I had known about her thought before I wrote my big chapter, the last chapter of Religion, Scientific Naturalism, on this, and I probably would have written a different kind of argument on that, because I just couldn't see any other way to do it. So I made a rather strong Platonic suggestion about attractors. But now, having learned something about Lynn Margulis, I see there are other ways. There is another way. So it's certainly not something that I'm going to be dogmatic about. It was a suggestion. I hope it was taken in that spirit. Also, some of the things I said about Platonic realism, I hear what you're taking, the implications of that, and I see that what I've said implied things that I didn't mean to imply. So at least I'll have to get my language to be more precise. But let me shut up and see what the questions, comments there might be.